On January 10, 2016, the world woke up to a sentence that felt impossible. David Bowie was dead. The shock was immediate, but what made it hit differently was timing. Just 2 days earlier, on his 69th birthday, Bowie had released Blackstar, a dark, strange, hypnotic album that critics were still trying to decode. At first, it looked like another reinvention from an artist who had spent his life turning transformation into spectacle. Then the news broke, and everything changed. The album was no longer just a new release. It became evidence, a message, a farewell the world had been listening to without realizing it. As the announcement spread, grief moved fast across continents. London mourned one of its most inventive sons. Berlin remembered the artist who had rebuilt himself in its shadows. New York, where Bowie had long lived, felt the loss like the disappearance of a permanent piece of cultural architecture. Fans gathered outside murals, record shops, theaters, and public squares. Radio stations turned to tribute mode. Social media filled with the same stunned reaction. How had he kept this hidden? Bowie had reportedly battled cancer in private, revealing almost nothing to the public. In an era when celebrity illness is often turned into headlines, he had done the opposite. He had stayed silent, finished the work, and left the stage on his own terms. And that is where the story becomes something more than a biography. Because David Bowie did not simply die after making an album, he seemed to shape his own exit through it. Songs like Lazarus and the imagery surrounding Blackstar suddenly felt loaded with intention, as if Bowie had transformed his final days into one last act of performance art. That is the central mystery we open here. Did David Bowie turn his own death into his final masterpiece? To answer that, we have to go back before Blackstar, before Ziggy Stardust, before the world knew his face. We have to return to the boy named David Jones, because long before he became the man who could disappear into any persona, he was just a child in London, already dreaming of becoming someone the world could never ignore. Before the world called him David Bowie, he was David Robert Jones, born in Brixton, London in 1947, into a post-war Britain still learning how to rebuild itself. His childhood was not dramatic in the way later headlines would be, but it carried something just as important: restlessness. He grew up in an England of ration book memory, changing youth culture and expanding media, where music was beginning to feel like a doorway out of ordinary life. Even early on, there was a sense that David did not want to simply belong to the world around him. He wanted to alter it, or at least slip beyond its limits. He was curious, visually alert, and drawn to performance long before he fully understood what kind of performer he might become. As a boy and teenager, he was fascinated not only by sound, but by image, theater, and mood. He studied art, listened obsessively to American rock and rhythm and blues, and learned instruments with the hunger of someone already trying to build a language for himself. Saxophone became one of his first true obsessions, but music alone was never enough. He was watching style, gesture, attitude, posture, how identity could be constructed and performed. One of the most defining moments of his youth came after a schoolyard fight that left him with a permanently altered pupil, creating the illusion of different colored eyes. It became part of his face, part of his mystery, part of the mythology. But long before the myth was useful, it was simply another reminder that David Jones was already being marked by difference. By the 1960s, he was moving through London's evolving youth culture, trying on influences, sounds, and ambitions that had not yet crystallized into a stable form. He joined bands, changed directions, experimented with ideas, and seemed determined not to remain fixed in one role for too long. That instinct would become one of the central engines of his life. He was not content to be talented in a single lane. He wanted range, transformation, permission to become multiple people without apology. The name David Bowie would come later, but the impulse behind it was already there. The refusal to stay ordinary, the refusal to remain only oneself. Before stardom, before fame, before reinvention became his signature, there was already a boy in London quietly deciding that reality, as it was handed to him, would never be enough. For a while, success refused to arrive. David Jones moved through the 1960s trying on sounds, bands, and identities, searching for a version of himself that could finally cut through the noise. He released songs that passed with little impact, joined scenes that shifted too fast to hold him, and watched others rise while he remained on the edge of recognition. But failure did not silence him, it sharpened him. He understood something many artists never do: talent alone would not be enough. If he wanted to be seen, he would have to become unforgettable. That is when David Jones began moving toward David Bowie. Not just a name change to avoid confusion with another performer, but the early outline of a larger artistic strategy. He would not wait for the world to define him. He would define himself first, again and again, until the world had no choice but to follow. The first real crack in the wall came with Space Oddity in 1969. Released at the edge of the moon landing era, the song felt perfectly timed and strangely haunting, introducing Bowie as someone who could turn pop music into atmosphere, loneliness, and cinematic distance. But even then, he was still becoming. The true explosion arrived in the early 1970s with Ziggy Stardust, not simply an album, not just a stage costume, but a full artistic invention. Ziggy was alien, rock star, prophet, fantasy, and provocation all at once. With flaming hair, theatrical makeup, and androgynous glamour, Bowie stepped onto the stage as if he had arrived from somewhere outside ordinary culture. At a time when pop music still carried clear expectations about masculinity, style, and identity, Bowie made ambiguity look electric. He didn't merely release songs, he offered transformation as spectacle. Audiences didn't just listen to Ziggy Stardust, they watched it, wore it, argued over it, and felt their own limits shifting in response. That is the moment David Bowie became global. The music mattered. Starman, Moonage Daydream, rock and roll suicide, but so did the total image. Bowie understood that sound, clothing, body language, and myth could fuse into one cultural event. He gave people permission to imagine themselves differently, and that made him more than a musician. He became a signal. In Britain, in Europe, in America, and far beyond, Bowie's influence spread through fashion, youth culture, magazines, television, and every corner of pop imagination. Yet the strange truth was that the more successful Ziggy became, the less Bowie seemed willing to remain inside him. He had built a masterpiece, but he had also built a mask so powerful it threatened to consume the face behind it. And that tension between invention and survival would define everything that came next. Because Bowie had now discovered his greatest weapon, reinvention. But once an artist learns how to escape one identity, staying inside any identity for too long can start to feel like death. The problem with creating a perfect persona is that eventually the persona begins to eat the person. After Ziggy Stardust made David Bowie a global icon, he did what almost no one expected. He killed the character before the world was ready to let him go. It was a shocking move, but it revealed something essential about Bowie. He did not want to become a prisoner of his own success. He wanted motion, so he kept changing, musically, visually, emotionally. Glam gave way to soul. The stage alien became a sharper, more elegant, more dangerous figure. Albums like Young Americans and Station to Station showed an artist refusing stability, but beneath the brilliance there was growing instability of another kind. Bowie was now living inside a machine of fame, performance, travel, and expectation that never truly stopped. Reinvention was his gift, but it was also becoming a survival mechanism. By the mid-1970s, that survival came with a cost. Cocaine use, paranoia, exhaustion, and emotional isolation began to shadow his life. The Thin White Duke era remains one of the most fascinating and unsettling chapters of Bowie's career because it fused artistic precision with personal unraveling. He looked immaculate, sounded controlled, and projected icy sophistication. Yet behind the image was a man drifting toward psychological collapse. Fame had widened his world, but also thinned it out. Hotels, studios, substances, obsession, and a growing sense that he was being consumed by the very myth-making he had mastered. Bowie would later distance himself from parts of this era, and for good reason. The work was powerful, but the human cost was real. Genius was still operating at full voltage. The man producing it was increasingly at risk. That is why Berlin matters so much. Berlin was not simply another stylish phase. It was, in many ways, an escape route. Leaving Los Angeles behind, Bowie moved to Europe and entered a colder, quieter, more fragmented atmosphere that allowed him to rebuild. Alongside collaborators like Brian Eno, he created music that sounded unlike pop stardom trying to remain fashionable. It sounded like recovery, experimentation, and reinvention stripped down to necessity. The so-called Berlin trilogy, Low, Heroes, and Lodger, became proof that Bowie could survive not by repeating what had made him famous, but by abandoning it. He did not return to the world as the same man. He returned as someone who had learned how to use art, not only to shock audiences, but to rescue himself. And that is what made Bowie different from almost every other icon of his era. Each time he disappeared, it was not always collapse. Sometimes it was strategy, sometimes it was healing, sometimes it was the only way to stay alive inside a career built on becoming someone else. In his final years, David Bowie seemed to recede without disappearing. He was no longer the omnipresent shapeshifter of earlier decades, no longer constantly reinventing himself in public view. Instead, he became quieter, more selective, almost ghost-like in the way he moved through culture. There were appearances, recordings, and carefully chosen projects, but much of his life folded inward. To the outside world, this looked like maturity, privacy, maybe even contentment. What almost no one understood was that another story was unfolding behind the silence. Bowie had been diagnosed with cancer, and he kept that reality almost entirely hidden. In an age when celebrity illness is often turned into public narrative, he did the opposite. He protected the secret, narrowed the circle, and continued working with extraordinary precision. The countdown had already begun, but the world was still reading him as merely quiet. That silence is what makes Blackstar feel almost supernatural in hindsight. Released on January 8, 2016, Bowie's 69th birthday, the album arrived like a riddle. It was dark, fragmented, elegant, unsettling, full of images that seemed to hover between theater, ritual, and death. At first, critics heard it as one more fearless reinvention from an artist who had always moved ahead of interpretation. But once Bowie died 2 days later, the album transformed overnight. Songs like Lazarus no longer sounded experimental in the usual sense. They sounded deliberate, intimate, and devastatingly direct. The music video for Lazarus, with Bowie in bed, eyes bandaged, body retreating into darkness, became impossible to watch as simple performance. It felt like a farewell staged with full awareness, not melodramatic, not sentimental, controlled. Bowie was not only making art while dying, he was turning the fact of dying into art. That is what gives his final chapter its unique emotional power. Many artists leave behind unfinished work, interrupted tours, or scattered fragments of what might have been. Bowie left behind something far stranger and more haunting, a completed final statement that seemed to know exactly when it would be heard correctly. He did not announce his suffering, he encoded it. He did not ask for pity, he composed his exit. And when the world finally realized what Blackstar was, grief came with another feeling: awe. Because even at the edge of death, David Bowie remained what he had always been, an artist unwilling to surrender authorship over his own image. He did not simply vanish, he choreographed disappearance. David Bowie's legacy survived because he never allowed himself to become only one thing. Most global icons are remembered for a single face, a single era, a single sound. Bowie left behind an entire universe of selves. To one generation, he was Ziggy Stardust. To another, the Berlin innovator. To others, the elegant outsider of the MTV age, the actor, the style prophet, the artist who made reinvention feel like a form of truth rather than disguise. That is why his influence still feels so alive. He did not simply create songs people loved. He created permission to change, to experiment, to refuse the prison of a fixed identity. His impact reached far beyond music. Bowie reshaped fashion, performance, gender expression, visual culture, and the very idea of what a public self could be. Long before conversations about identity became common, he was already showing the world that masculinity, beauty, art, and performance did not have to obey old rules. He made strangeness glamorous. He made ambiguity magnetic. For countless artists, outsiders, and young people trying to imagine a life beyond what was expected of them, Bowie was not just a star. He was evidence that transformation could be survival. That may be the deepest reason his death felt so unusual. The world was not losing a fixed legend. It was losing an artist who had taught generations how not to disappear inside convention. And yet, in another sense, he never left. Bowie remains in songs, silhouettes, photographs, fashion editorials, stage lighting, and every artist bold enough to turn identity into creation. Blackstar did not close his legacy. It completed the final arc of it. He turned mortality into design, farewell into art, and silence into one last statement. Some stars fade because time moves on. Bowie became larger because time kept catching up to him. he did not go out. He changed form one final time.